Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 4. For the first time since he was a very small pup, Scrub was not half-starved and constantly on the prowl for something to steal. Now, twice a day, there was all the food he could eat. He soon forgot about dodging rocks and clubs and avoiding Kino and the pack of Aurora dogs. Instead of curling up to sleep beneath a bush in some old building or an abandoned mine shaft, Scrub had his own blanket in the corner of the kitchen. The room was always warm. The people spoke quietly, kindly, and delicious mouth-watering odors kept his black nose twitching. At first, he avoided the dogs staked out around the cabin, but when they paid no attention to him, he finally hobbled over to visit. Noble, the big white leader, welcomed him with much sniffing and a waving plume. In turn, the rest of the team accepted him. Scrub was the first pet David ever had. He talked to the dog in a low, intimate voice, while he scratched the thick fur of his forehead and patted the deepening chest until it boomed like a drum. "You're going to have a bigger chest than Noble in a few months," he'd say. At such times, Scrub would lower his head and push against the boy in a way of inviting more patting and scratching. "I love you too," David said. "We make a good team." Or, "I like you too," David said. "We make a good team." Scrub expected to go everywhere with David and share in all his activities. The two were outside so much that Celia often had to hunt for them to come to meals. This pleased both parents, for David had been morose and listless since the accident. Now his voice would ring out across the clearing a dozen times a day, and he and Scrub would be off on some business of their own. The boy on his crutches, the dog hobbling beside, carefully holding his splintered leg above the ground. They returned often to the riverbank. It was about as far as they could hobble, taking their time, resting often. They would lie side by side in the grass and listen to the river. Often the dog's big head was on the boy's good knee. David would bare his leg to the warm sun and gently massage the weakened muscles. Scrub would doze and then try to lick the sore spots between the splints. David spent hours fishing with the flies Scotty had tied. He became quite expert and kept the table well supplied with trout. His excitement when he hooked a fish was immense. He shouted and laughed. He played the fish expertly, finally lifting it in a clean pull to land flopping in the grass. Scrub shared the excitement. He stood beside David and barked encouragement. The moment the fish landed, he grabbed it and carried it to David with the air of having caught it himself. David would pat him and say, "We caught him, didn't we? I don't know what I'd do without your help. I don't know what I'll do without your help." Scrub would wave his tail and lift his hips in a grin to show that he understood they had caught the fish together. Then came a day when they made it from the cabin to the river without stopping to rest. David smiled at Scrub and said, "You're doing fine." Scrub shoved his head against David and the boy patted his sides. "You're gaining weight. I can hardly feel your ribs. You're going to look great." David could almost see the daily change in Scrub. As the dog filled out, the gangling, clumsy look began to disappear. His body was catching up. David was sure Jackson would want Scrub when he saw him without his splints. He tried to wipe that worry from his mind as he watched the dog grow stronger, his lean sides fill out, and the sheen come to his wolf-gray coat. "He's beginning to look fine, don't you think, Mom?" he asked his mother one morning. "With what he eats, he should," Celia said. "That dog out-eats the three of us morning and night." "He never had a good meal before he came here," David explained. "He's making up for lost time." "Lost time," his father's eyes were twinkling. "That dog's making up for time before he was born." But no one begrudged Scrub a bite. David was counting the days until he could walk, but each day he cared more about the changes in Scrub and himself. A coat of tan was covering his own pale skin. His strength had improved. He was sure he could hobble to Aurora and back now. His leg muscles no longer hurt when he massaged them or when he exercised the leg. The pains he'd known at night were gone. One day he noticed that Scrub was touching his splinted legs lightly on the ground and making stepping motions with it. He tried too and felt only a momentary weakness and pain. From then on, he put his foot down lightly just as Scrub was doing. It was another memorable day. The changes on the river made him most aware of the passage of time. He didn't always fish when they hobbled out there. Often he lay on the bank with Scrub close beside him, watched the water, and let the good warm sun beat down on him. He saw the baby ducks and geese change from downy fluff balls to small birds sprouting their first feathers. The adult birds molted, lost their primaries, and were unable to fly. They would remain earthbound until they grew new primaries for the long flight south this fall. The river level dropped, leaving a stretch of barren beach, which was no hiding place for the pair of prowling foxes. The moose and calf came almost daily to the river. The calf was now sure-footed and waded into the water to feed with its mother. The lazy summer days slipped away. The morning of the 21st day, David said nothing to his parents. He had been unable to sleep for thinking of this day. After breakfast, his mother asked, "What are you and Scrub doing today?" "Guess we'll go fishing." "Good. We haven't had fish for several days. You planning anything else?" "No." She had never asked before what he planned to do with his day. He waited, curious. She continued, moving about the kitchen, cleaning up breakfast dishes. "Be sure and get back for lunch," she said finally. "I will." He hobbled outside, got the fish pole with Scrub beside him, headed for the river. He was glad his parents had forgotten this was the day. He wanted to be alone with Scrub, to do this his own way. If he failed, he didn't want them to see. David lowered himself carefully in his favorite spot on the riverbank and leaned the fish pole against a rock. He had no intention of fishing today. Scrub lay down beside him. The ducks and geese were busy about their business against the far shore. Their faint gabbling was the only sound this morning. A small breeze barely stirred the leaves. He guessed the moose and her calf wouldn't come until later in the day. But David was not interested in the ducks and geese or thinking about the moose. Finally, he patted Scrub's big head and said, "Scotty told us this would be the day. I guess there's no use waiting any longer. You go first." David began loosening the splints. His fingers trembled. "It's going to hurt like 60, he said, "but here goes." He carefully unwound the binding and took the splints off. "There you are. You can try it any time." He watched the dog intently. Scrub smelled the leg and licked the broken spot. He rose, still on 3 legs, and took a couple of hobbling steps. Then he seemed to realize the bandages and splints were gone. He put the paw on the ground and immediately lifted it. For a moment he balanced there, then carefully lowered the foot again. He hobbled off a few feet, then turned and came back and lay down. That small exertion seemed to have exhausted him. David knew what the dog was going through. Scotty had been wrong. The leg was not healed. Scrub was aware of this and quit, just as David had been forced to do. But soon the dog was up again. He limped a few steps and stopped, but he didn't lie down. He began walking again and limped a circle around David, head down, ears flattened to his head. He wandered off and returned. David could see, or he imagined, the dog was putting more weight on the leg. The limp seemed a little less pronounced. Scrub walked farther between steps. David's fists were clenched. What had Scotty said? He'll endure pain. He does what nature tells him he has to do to walk again. Scotty had been right. Scrub's leg was healed. The dog was proving it with every step. David called Scrub to him and patted his head. He held the big head between his hands and shook him lovingly. "You made it! You made it!" Scrub wagged his tail and lifted his lips in a grin. David drew a deep breath. "Scotty said when you walked I could. Well, here goes." David got carefully to his feet and balanced on the crutches. His palms were wet. He was shaking and for a moment could not stop. This was the day he'd waited so long for, and now he was afraid. He straightened his leg gingerly, put his foot flat on the ground, and bore down with weight. He dropped the crutches and stood. Pain was a knife that made him lift the foot, as Scrub had done. Maybe if he tried to walk. He got off 3 quick steps, then the weakened leg folded. He sprawled, full length, wrenching the muscles of the leg as he fell. David rolled over and sat up, holding the leg with both hands. He wasn't crying, but he couldn't stop tears from squeezing between his shut lids. Then he felt Scrub's warm tongue licking his cheek. David put his arms around the furry neck and held the dog close until the worst pain had passed. Then he got up and tried again. He balanced on the good leg and brought his weight down carefully on the bad one. The pain was no worse. He knew then that his task, too, was to endure the pain. David managed to grin at Scrub and said, "You're not the only one who can walk." He picked out a big rock as a target a few steps away and made it. Next, he limped a circle around the rock, close enough so that he could grab it if he started to fall. He didn't. David leaned against the rock and rested a couple of minutes. Then he picked up the crutches, limped to the edge of the bank, and hurled them into the river. "Come on," he said triumphantly to Scrub. "Let's go home." It was not the proud, heads-up, joyous return David had visualized. It was slow and painful, and they had to stop several times to rest. The dog made better time than the boy, but he slowed his pace, and they traveled together. They went through the trees and across the clearing to the cabin. When David stepped through the door, his mother and father were in the kitchen. He had planned to say something exciting and dramatic, but all he could think of was the great distance they'd come, and he said, "We made it. We both made it." "You sure did." His father gripped his arm. "You sure did, son." Then he turned his head quickly away. David noticed there was dirt on both his father's and mother's shoes. Fresh grass stems were caught in the eyelets, as would happen if you ran through grass. "You followed us," David said. "You saw." "Oh, David, we had to know," his mother said. "We were sure you and Scrub would try, and we guessed you wanted to be alone." She put her arms around him and began to cry. And that's the end of chapter 4.